Deal with this senile old woman, Claire said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the machines. And for a moment I thought I had misheard her, thought maybe grief had started playing tricks on my ears. But when I turned, I saw the way she stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes impatient, as if Evelyn were an inconvenience instead of a person who had lived 89 years and held this family together long before Claire ever learned our last name. And I felt something cold settle in my chest because Ethan didn't correct her, didn't even look at me. He just stared at his phone like there was something more important on that screen than the woman who had once taught him how to tie his shoes. I stayed where I was, beside the bed, my hand resting lightly over Evelyn's, her skin thin and cool beneath my fingers. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers, the afternoon light slipping through the blinds in narrow baluss of pale gold that stretched across the floor. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like time had slowed just enough for me to notice the small things I might have missed before. The uneven rhythm of the monitor, the quiet click of Claire's heels as she stepped back toward the hallway, the way Ethan followed without a word, leaving me alone with the woman they had already dismissed. I leaned closer, not sure if she could hear me, not sure if she was even aware. But then her fingers moved, just slightly, tightening around mine in a way that was deliberate, not random, and I froze, my breath catching as I looked down at her face. Her eyes still closed, but her brow faintly drawn as if she were holding on to something important, something unfinished. And suddenly Claire's words echoed differently in my mind. Not just cruel, but convenient, because calling someone senile makes it easier to ignore them, easier to speak over them, easier to take what they can no longer defend. I glanced toward the door, making sure we were still alone, and then back at Evelyn, my heart beginning to beat a little faster as a quiet realization began to take shape, because that small squeeze of her hand didn't feel like confusion, it felt like intention. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I understood that whatever was happening here, it wasn't as simple as they wanted me to believe. I did not move my hand from Evelyn's, even after the hallway fell quiet, and the sound of Claire's heels faded completely, because that small pressure of her fingers lingered, faint but unmistakable, and I found myself watching her more closely than I had all afternoon, studying the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the slight tension in her jaw, details that did not match the picture they had painted of a woman who was no longer aware of anything around her. The late sunlight had shifted now, stretching higher along the wall, casting long shadows across the room, and the steady beeping of the monitor felt louder in the silence, like it was marking time that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. I leaned forward just enough to bring my voice closer to her ear, keeping it soft, careful, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile connection had just formed. And I said her name once, quietly, then again, a little firmer. And although her eyes did not open, her fingers tightened again, this time more clearly, a deliberate response that sent a chill down my spine. Because it was not confusion, it was recognition. I sat back slowly, my mind beginning to piece together something I had not allowed myself to consider before. The way Claire had spoken, the way Ethan had avoided looking at either of us. The conversations I had overheard in fragments over the past few weeks about paperwork and timing and decisions that seemed to be made without including the one person who should have mattered most. I glanced toward the door again, half expecting them to walk back in, but the hallway remained empty. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me that I was not meant to witness this moment, that whatever was happening here had been arranged to unfold without interference. I shifted my chair a little closer to the bed, lowering my voice even further, and I told Evelyn that I was here, that I was not going anywhere, and that if there was something she needed me to understand, she only had to try, because I would listen, truly listen, in a way no one else in this room seemed willing to do. Her breathing remained steady, her eyes still closed, but that faint pressure of her hand did not fade, and in that small, silent exchange, I began to understand that the word they had used so easily, so casually, was not just an insult, it was a strategy, a way to erase her voice before she could use it. And as I sat there, holding her hand while the afternoon slipped slowly into evening, I realized that whatever they believed about her, they were wrong, and whatever they were planning, they had not expected me to notice. The door opened just enough for their voices to slip back into the room before they did, low and hurried, the kind of conversation people think cannot be heard if they keep it quiet. And I did not turn toward them right away. I kept my eyes on Evelyn, my hand still wrapped around hers, as if I had not noticed anything at all, because something told me it mattered that they believed I was still just sitting here, just waiting, just grieving. Claire was the first to step inside, her heels softer, now against the floor, but her tone unchanged, controlled, efficient. She moved to the counter by the sink and set down a thin folder, the sound of paper against the surface sharper than it should have been in such a quiet room. Ethan followed a moment later, slower, his gaze flickering toward the bed and then away again, like he could not quite bring himself to look directly at his grandmother, or at me. "We need to make sure everything is signed before tomorrow," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough. The doctor already noted her condition, so there should not be any issues. Ethan hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. "Are you sure this is the right time?" he asked, not out of concern, but uncertainty, the kind that comes from not wanting to be responsible. Claire let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, more like impatience. "There is no better time, Ethan, you know that. We have been over this," she replied, flipping open the folder and scanning the pages as if she were reviewing a grocery list instead of something that carried weight. I shifted slightly in my chair, slow enough that it would seem like nothing more than a tired movement, but just enough to see the edge of the document she had placed on the counter. I could not read the words from where I sat, but I saw the lines, the spaces for signatures, the official formatting that always looks the same no matter what it is asking someone to give up. My grip on Evelyn's hand tightened without me realizing it, and again, she responded, a faint pressure back, steady, intentional, as if she understood exactly what was being said in this room even if her eyes remained closed. Claire continued speaking, outlining steps, timelines, things that needed to be handled, and with every word, the picture became clearer. This was not about care, it was about control, about making decisions quickly, quietly, before anyone could question them, before anyone could slow them down. Ethan finally nodded, though it looked more like surrender than agreement, and I felt something shift inside me then, something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with clarity, because they were not waiting for her to be gone, they were waiting for her to be unable to stop them. And as I sat there, still and silent, I realized that the only reason they were speaking so freely was because they believed she no longer had a voice, and worse, that I would never use mine. I did not speak while Claire continued to turn those pages with quiet precision, but my mind had already drifted somewhere else, somewhere years back to a different version of this family, a version where Evelyn sat at the head of her long oak dining table every Sunday afternoon, her posture straight, her voice calm but firm, the kind of presence that did not need to be loud to be respected. I could still remember the first time I walked into that house as a young bride, uncertain, carrying a casserole dish that I was convinced was undercooked, and how the room had gone still for a moment when I stepped inside, everyone measuring me, everyone except Evelyn, who had looked up from her seat, met my eyes, and given me the smallest nod, just enough to say you are welcome here, just enough to steady my hands. She had been the one who made space for me when no one else did, the one who told Daniel, gently but clearly, that a marriage was not something you controlled, but something you built. The one who slipped me a handwritten recipe card later that evening and said, "In this family, you will need patience more than anything else." And she had been right. Over the years I learned how to read the silences at that table, how to understand what was said and what was carefully left unsaid, and through all of it, Evelyn had remained constant, watching, guiding without ever forcing. There were moments, small but significant, when she would pull me aside and ask simple questions that felt heavier than they sounded, like whether I kept copies of important documents, whether I knew exactly what was in Daniel's name and what was not. At the time, I thought she was simply being thorough, practical, in the way older generations often are. But now, sitting here in this quiet room with the faint hum of machines and Claire's voice still lingering in the background, those questions felt different. They felt like warnings I had not fully understood. I looked down at Evelyn again, at the stillness of her face, the fine lines that traced years of decisions and quiet strength, and I realized how easy it must be for someone like Claire to mistake silence for weakness, to assume that because a woman chooses not to argue, she no longer has anything left to say. But Evelyn had never been weak, not once, and if she had taught me anything, it was that the most important things were often protected quietly, without announcement, without spectacle. I shifted my chair slightly, placing myself more firmly between the bed and the rest of the room, not in a way that would be noticed, but in a way that felt deliberate to me. And as I did, her fingers moved again against mine, faint but steady, and this time I understood it not just as recognition, but as trust, a silent confirmation that whatever had been set in motion outside this room was not the full story, and that somewhere, beneath the surface of everything Claire believed she had already secured, there was something she had missed. I kept my posture steady, my expression unchanged, even as Claire closed the folder with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have, and for a moment neither of them spoke, as if they were both waiting for something, some reaction, some sign that I had heard enough to question them. But I did not give it to them. I only adjusted the blanket lightly over Evelyn's arm, a simple gesture that allowed me to lean closer again, to feel the faint warmth of her skin and the quiet strength still present in the way her fingers rested against mine. And then Claire moved, stepping closer to the bed with a practiced kind of gentleness that felt more like performance than care. She glanced at me briefly, her smile thin and controlled. "You have been here a long time, Margaret. You should get some rest," she said, her tone polite, but edged with something firmer beneath it. Something that suggested she would prefer I was not here at all. I met her eyes for just a second, before looking back down at Evelyn, keeping my voice calm, almost absent. "I am fine right here," I replied, and that was enough to shift something in the room. A small tension that neither of them addressed, but both clearly felt. Ethan cleared his throat, his gaze moving between us as if searching for a way to smooth over something he did not fully understand. "Mom, Claire is right. You have been here all day," he added. But there was no conviction in his voice, only habit, the kind that comes from repeating someone else's reasoning. I did not respond to him. Instead, I leaned in slightly, brushing a strand of hair gently away from Evelyn's temple. And as I did, I noticed it, something I had not seen before, tucked just beneath the edge of her pillow, a small piece of folded paper, barely visible unless you were this close. My heart slowed, not racing, but sharpening, every detail becoming clearer in an instant. I did not reach for it right away, did not let my hand move toward it in any way that could be noticed. I simply stayed there, my fingers still laced with hers, my other hand resting lightly on the blanket, waiting, listening. Claire had already turned away again, speaking quietly to Ethan about schedules, about who would come by in the morning, about what still needed to be taken care of. But her words felt distant now, secondary to the quiet realization forming in my mind, because Evelyn had never been careless, not with important things, not with things she wanted protected. And if she had left something within reach of her own hand, hidden just enough to go unnoticed by anyone who was not paying attention, then it was not an accident. It was intention. I let a few more seconds pass, long enough for them to settle back into their quiet conversation, long enough for the moment to feel ordinary again. And then, slowly, carefully, I shifted my hand just enough to slide that small folded piece of paper free, keeping it low, out of sight, my movements as natural as adjusting the blanket, as if I had done nothing at all. But as soon as it was in my palm, I felt the weight of it, not in ounces, but in meaning. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I knew that whatever they believed they had already secured, they had missed something that Evelyn had made sure would not be overlooked. I did not open the paper right away. I only held it there in my palm, folded into something small and deliberate, as if even the act of reading it needed the right moment, the right distance from the quiet surveillance of that room. Claire was still speaking in that measured tone of hers, outlining plans for the next day, as though she were organizing a schedule instead of circling something final. Ethan nodded along, his responses short, distracted, and I realized then how little attention they were paying to me now, how certain they were that I would remain exactly where they had placed me, quiet, compliant, unimportant to whatever decisions they believed had already been made. I stayed a few minutes longer, long enough to make my presence feel unchanged, predictable. Then I slowly eased my hand from Evelyn's, careful not to disturb her, though her fingers tightened once more before letting go. A subtle resistance that felt like a message in itself. I leaned closer, just enough that my voice would not carry beyond the edge of the bed, and I told her softly that I would be back, that I understood more than they thought, and that she did not have to worry about being unheard. Her expression did not change, but something in the stillness felt different, less abandoned, more certain. I straightened, smoothing the blanket one last time before stepping back. Claire glanced at me as I moved toward the door, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if she were measuring something she could not quite define. "You are leaving?" she asked, not quite a question, more like confirmation. I gave a small nod, keeping my voice even. "I will come back in the morning," I said, and that seemed to satisfy her, at least enough for her to return her attention to the folder on the counter. Ethan looked at me briefly, something uncertain flickering across his face, but he said nothing, and that silence told me more than any words could have. I walked out into the hallway, the air cooler there, the fluorescent lights brighter, harsher, and I did not stop until I reached the end of the corridor where the noise of the room could no longer reach me. Only then did I unfold the paper, slowly, carefully, as if it might fall apart if I moved too quickly. The handwriting was unmistakable, firm despite its age, each letter formed with intention, not the scattered marks of someone who had lost their clarity. And as my eyes moved across the lines, the quiet certainty I had felt began to take shape into something sharper, something undeniable, because this was not confusion. This was instruction, clear and deliberate, a name, an address, and beneath it, a short sentence that carried more weight than anything Claire had said in that room. "Do not let them decide for me." I read it again, just to be sure, and as I stood there in that narrow stretch of hallway, the paper steady in my hands, I understood that whatever had been planned around Evelyn was not finished yet, not while she still had a way to be heard, and not while I was still willing to listen. I stood there for a long moment after reading those words, the paper still open in my hands, the fluorescent lights above humming softly as if nothing in the world had shifted, but something had, something quiet and irreversible, because Evelyn had not just asked for help. She had anticipated this, planned for it in a way that meant she had seen it coming long before I had. I folded the paper carefully along the same lines it had held before, pressing the creases flat with my fingers as if preserving it exactly as she had left it mattered, and then I slipped it into my purse. Not hurried, not hidden, just deliberate, the way she would have done it. I took a breath and turned back toward the hallway that led to her room, my steps steady now, not because I felt calm, but because I understood what needed to be done next. When I reached the doorway, I paused just enough to listen before stepping inside. Their voices were lower now, more controlled, but the tone had not changed. Claire was still directing, still outlining, still speaking as if everything had already been decided. Ethan responded in short sentences, agreeing more out of habit than certainty. I stepped into the room without hesitation this time, and both of them looked up, Claire first, her expression composed but watchful, Ethan a second later, his posture shifting slightly as if my presence had interrupted something he did not want questioned. I moved back to the chair beside the bed and sat down, placing my hands calmly in my lap, not reaching for Evelyn this time. Not yet. Claire tilted her head just slightly, studying me. "I thought you were leaving," she said, her voice smooth, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now. I met her gaze briefly before answering, keeping my tone even, almost thoughtful. "I needed a minute," I said, and then I let my eyes move to Ethan, holding his attention just long enough for him to look away first. The silence that followed was not loud, but it carried weight, because something had shifted. Even if they could not name it yet, I leaned back, slightly in my chair, as if settling in for the evening, and that small action seemed to unsettle Claire more than anything else. She closed the folder in front of her, slower this time, more deliberate, as if reconsidering the pace she had set before. "We will go over the rest tomorrow," she said to Ethan, but her eyes flicked toward me again, measuring, adjusting. Ethan nodded, relieved to follow her lead, and as they gathered their things, I reached out once more and placed my hand gently over Evelyn's. Her fingers responded again, faint but present, and this time I did not hide the small pause it caused in me. I let it be seen. Just enough, just long enough, because I wanted them to notice, to question, to feel the smallest crack in the certainty they had been holding on to. And as Claire walked past me toward the door, I spoke, not loudly, not confrontationally, just clearly enough that she could not pretend she had not heard. "She knows more than you think," I said, and the way Claire stopped, just for a fraction of a second before continuing out into the hallway, told me everything I needed to know about how close we were to something she had not planned for. The room felt different after they left, not quieter, but clearer, as if the absence of their voices had made space for something more honest to exist. I sat there for a while without moving, my hand resting over Evelyn's, feeling the faint but steady presence of her grip, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to think beyond the room, beyond the hospital, toward the name and address written on that small piece of paper now tucked safely in my purse. It was not just a location, it was a direction, something intentional, something she had trusted me to follow. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the numbers steady and indifferent, and I realized how little time there might be before Claire tried to move everything forward, before whatever documents she had prepared were placed in front of someone willing to sign off on them without question. I leaned closer to Evelyn again, my voice low and steady. "I am going to take care of it," I said, not as a promise made lightly, but as something firm, something that would not be undone by hesitation. Her fingers pressed against mine once more, not stronger, not weaker, just enough to remind me that she was still there, still aware in the ways that mattered. I sat back slowly, letting my hand linger for a moment longer before easing it away, this time with more certainty than before, because now I understood that staying here was not the only way to stand beside her. There were things that needed to be done outside this room, things she had already set in motion. I stood, smoothing my coat as I moved toward the door, the hallway beyond still bright under the fluorescent lights, still carrying the distant sounds of footsteps and quiet conversations, but none of it felt as distant as it had before. I walked with purpose now, each step aligned with the thought forming clearly in my mind. The address she had written was across town, a place I recognized only vaguely, an older part of the city where time seemed to move a little slower, where people kept things the way they had always been, and that alone told me something about why she had chosen it. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers descend one by one, and as the doors opened, I stepped inside without hesitation. The paper in my purse felt heavier now, not because of its size, but because of what it carried, not just information, but trust. And as the elevator doors closed, sealing me away from the quiet calculations happening upstairs, I understood that whatever Claire believed she was controlling, she had overlooked the one thing Evelyn had protected most carefully, the truth she had left behind for someone willing to see it. The night air outside the hospital felt colder than I expected, not because of the temperature, but because everything inside me had shifted, sharpened into something focused and steady. I walked to my car without rushing, each step deliberate, my mind already mapping out the route to the address Evelyn had written. The city looked different at this hour, quieter, the streetlights casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. And for a moment, I allowed myself to sit behind the wheel without starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as I replayed every word I had heard that afternoon, every glance, every pause, the way Claire had spoken with such certainty, as if the outcome was already secured, as if Evelyn had already been reduced to a signature waiting to happen. I started the car and pulled out slowly, the engine hummed steady beneath me, grounding in a way I needed. The address led me across town, away from the newer developments and into an older neighborhood where the houses stood closer together, their porches lit with soft yellow bulbs. The kind of place where people still noticed when a car passed by too slowly. I turned down the street written on the paper and eased to a stop in front of a narrow brick building with a small brass plaque beside the door. The name etched into it was one I recognized faintly, not from recent years but from conversations long ago, the kind that had seemed unimportant at the time. Something about Evelyn's preference for people who handled things quietly, carefully. I stepped out of the car and approached the door. The building felt still, almost untouched by time. And when I pressed the buzzer, there was a pause just long enough to make me aware of how much depended on this moment. Then a voice answered, measured and calm, asking who was there. I gave my name, adding Evelyn's in the same breath. And there was another pause, shorter this time, followed by the soft click of the lock releasing. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, and a man stepped into view from an office just beyond, his expression composed but attentive. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, as if he had been expecting something like this, even if not the exact moment. I reached into my purse and unfolded the paper once more, placing it carefully on the desk between us, watching as his eyes moved over the handwriting. And in the quiet that followed, I saw the subtle shift in his posture, the recognition, the understanding that this was not a casual visit, not a misunderstanding, but something precise, something that had been set aside for a moment exactly like this. And as he looked back up at me, there was no confusion in his gaze, only a calm acknowledgement that whatever had been planned elsewhere was about to meet something far more deliberate. He did not rush to speak, which told me more than if he had reacted immediately. Instead, he picked up the paper with both hands, holding it flat against the desk as his eyes moved slowly across each word, not skimming, not guessing, but reading with the kind of care that comes from understanding that details matter. I stood across from him without interrupting, my posture steady, my hands resting lightly at my sides. And for a moment the room felt suspended in a quiet that was not empty but deliberate, as if the weight of what Evelyn had written needed space to settle fully before anything else could be said. When he finally looked up, there was no surprise in his expression, only confirmation. "She kept this exactly as I advised," he said, his voice low but certain, and something in the way he spoke made it clear that this was not the first time Evelyn had anticipated resistance. I felt a small shift inside me then, not relief, not yet, but a clearer understanding that she had not been as vulnerable as Claire believed. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk, and I sat without hesitation. The polished wood cooled beneath my hands as I placed them on the edge of the desk. "They are moving quickly," I said, keeping my tone even. "They already have documents prepared." He nodded once, not surprised, not alarmed, just acknowledging what he had likely expected all along. "That is why she came to me months ago," he replied, opening a drawer and retrieving a thin folder, setting it down between us with the same measured precision Claire had used earlier. But this felt different, grounded, controlled, not rushed. He opened the folder and turned it slightly so I could see. Inside were documents, neatly organized, each page marked, each section prepared with intention. "These are her directives," he said. "Signed, witnessed, and protected under conditions that cannot be overridden by convenience or timing." I studied the pages, not reading every word yet, but recognizing the structure, the formal language that carried weight in ways casual decisions never could. He continued. "She was very clear about her concerns, especially regarding any attempt to question her mental capacity during this period." His eyes met mine then, steady and direct. "She anticipated exactly what you are describing." I let out a slow breath, not out of exhaustion but clarity, because this was no longer just suspicion, no longer just fragments of overheard conversations. This was structure, intention, something built to withstand pressure. "What do we do next?" I asked, and he closed the folder carefully, resting his hand over it for a brief moment before answering. "We do not rush," he said. "We let them proceed exactly as they intend. And when they do, we present this at the moment it matters most." There was no urgency in his voice, only certainty. And as I sat there, looking at the folder, at the quiet strength Evelyn had left behind in these pages, I understood that whatever Claire believed she was controlling was about to meet something far more deliberate than she had prepared for. I did not stay longer than necessary, because I understood now that timing was not about speed, it was about precision. And as I stepped back out into the night, the folder no longer in my hands but firmly anchored in something far more secure, I felt a quiet steadiness settle over me that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with certainty. The drive back to the hospital felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because my thoughts were no longer scattered, each piece now connected, each detail aligned with something larger that had been set in motion long before today. When I walked back into the building, the fluorescent lights no longer felt harsh, only constant, and I moved through the hallway without hesitation, the door to Evelyn's room slightly ajar, voices inside, low but tense in a way that was different from before. I paused just long enough to hear Claire speaking. Her tone controlled but sharper now. "We cannot delay this again, Ethan. The longer we wait, the more complicated it becomes." And Ethan responded, quieter, uncertain, "I just do not want any issues later." I pushed the door open then, not forcefully, just enough to enter without breaking the rhythm of their conversation, and both of them turned toward me, Claire's expression shifting almost instantly into something composed, something practiced, while Ethan's hesitation became more visible. I walked in and took my place beside the bed again, my movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I placed my hand over Evelyn's once more, and as expected, there was that faint but unmistakable response, her fingers pressing back against mine, and this time I did not hide it at all. I let the moment sit there, visible, undeniable. Claire's eyes flicked to our hands, just briefly, but it was enough, a small fracture in the certainty she had carried all day. "She is still responding," I said, my voice even, not confrontational, simply factual, and the room grew quieter, not empty, but cautious. Ethan shifted his weight, his gaze moving between me and the bed, uncertainty growing where there had once been avoidance. Claire stepped closer, her posture tightening just slightly. "That does not change the situation," she replied, but there was something different now, something less assured. I looked at her then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that carried its own weight. "It changes everything," I said, and I let the words settle, not explaining further, not offering more than necessary, because I no longer needed to. The difference was already there, in the way she held her breath for just a second too long, in the way Ethan did not immediately agree with her, in the way the room itself seemed to pause around a truth that was no longer as easy to ignore. And as I stood there, steady, present, I understood that this was the moment where their certainty began to unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that things fall apart when they are built on something that was never as solid as it seemed. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the same pale light filtering through the hospital blinds, the same steady rhythm of machines filling the room, but everything beneath that surface had shifted, not visibly, not loudly, but in a way that could not be undone. Claire stood near the window with the same folder in her hands, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, while Ethan lingered closer to the door, his uncertainty no longer hidden behind distraction. I took my place beside Evelyn without speaking, my hand finding hers with a quiet familiarity that no one in that room could challenge, and when her fingers responded, faint but certain, I felt something settle fully into place inside me. Not hope, not fear, but resolve. Claire began to speak then, outlining what she called necessary steps, her voice measured, controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried before. She placed the documents on the small table beside the bed, turning them slightly as if presentation alone could make them valid. "We should proceed while everything is clear," she said, and the choice of words did not go unnoticed. I let a brief silence pass, long enough for her to feel it, long enough for Ethan to shift his weight again, and then I reached into my purse, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same calm precision she had used the day before. I placed the folded paper on the table first, then another document, thicker, more formal, the one prepared long before this moment had been forced into motion. Claire's eyes moved to it immediately, her composure tightening, and for the first time, she did not speak right away. I met her gaze steadily, not raising my voice, not needing to. "These are her directives," I said, echoing the words I had been given, and I watched as the certainty she had carried began to fracture in small, undeniable ways. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes scanning the pages, confusion giving way to something sharper, something closer to realization. "This was done months ago," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, and I nodded once, because that was the truth, the part they had not accounted for, the part Evelyn had protected with quiet foresight. Claire reached for the documents, her movements controlled but no longer effortless, and as she read, the silence in the room deepened, not empty, but heavy with the weight of something undeniable. I did not interrupt her. I did not explain further, because I did not need to. The structure spoke for itself. The intention was clear. And in that stillness, the narrative they had been building began to fall away. Not with confrontation, but with fact. When Claire finally looked up, there was no anger in her expression, only calculation interrupted, and I realized then that the outcome was no longer hers to shape. I turned back to Evelyn, my hand still resting over hers, and for the first time, I allowed myself a quiet breath, not of relief, but of completion, because she had not been erased, not silenced, not reduced to something convenient. She had been heard, exactly as she intended, and as I stood there, steady and present, I understood that they had called her senile because it made everything easier for them. But in the end, the only thing they had truly misjudged was the part of her that never stopped thinking, never stopped preparing, and never stopped making sure the truth would find its way to someone willing to see it.